Okay, so I want to try something a little different today. I want you to just close your eyes for a second. Just humor me here.
Oh, boy.
No, really. Imagine you are standing in the middle of a vast, completely endless desert. But it is not empty. The wind is just howling, whipping sand right into your face. And carried on that wind, you hear everything.
Everything. Like literally everything.
I mean, literally everything. You hear the clatter of a marketplace in ancient Babylon. You hear the dragging of heavy iron chains in the Roman Empire. You hear the sharp crack of a judge's gavel in a modern courtroom in New York. You hear voices, thousands and thousands of them screaming totally different rules at you all at once.
That sounds intense.
Right. One voice screams, an eye for an eye. Another whispers, turn the other cheek. One shouts, this land belongs to the strongest. Another says, all men are created equal.
Yeah, that doesn't really sound like a desert. That sounds like a full-blown panic attack. It's like a crowded room where everyone is shouting contradictory orders at the exact same time.
Exactly. It is pure chaos.
Yeah.
And honestly, that dizziness you feel right now, that is a feeling I get when I really, truly look at human history. And that is what we are digging into today. We are doing a deep dive into a heavy stack of source material today. Articles, philosophical essays, theology. They all tackle maybe the biggest headache in the human experience. It's what philosophers call the empiricist's challenge.
Right, which, simply put, is the clash between the claim of a divine law and the incredibly messy, contradictory reality of human life on Earth.
Yeah. Here is the mission for this deep dive. We are told, especially in religious traditions, that there is a divine law, that it's eternal, that it's unchanging, it's the ultimate bedrock. But if you actually look at the track record, the ground is constantly moving under our feet.
It's the staccato of reality.
The staccato of reality. That is such a great phrase from the text. It's jarring. Look at the data points our sources highlight today. It's just a laundry list of contradictions. Things that were once absolute duties like polygamy are now crimes in many places. Things that were seen as, economic necessities, like leaving a weak infant on a hillside to die, are now viewed as the ultimate horror.
Or slavery.
Yes, slavery. It was the bedrock of civilization for millennia, endorsed by kings and philosophers. And now it's the ultimate sin.
So the core question here is, if the law is actually fixed, why does the moral map keep changing?
Exactly. Is morality just a local custom wearing a holy mask? Is it just fashion? Because if you look at the raw historical data, it sure looks like we're just making it up as we go along.
It's a really powerful critique. And honestly, if you stay on the ground level, if you keep your eyes locked on the sand in your desert analogy, it's almost impossible to refute. To navigate this, we need to stop looking at the ground for a second and look up. We need to find a frequency that cuts through that chaotic noise, a sort of deep, resonant sub-bass that grounds everything.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Our sources today are fascinating because they don't deny the chaos. They don't try to whitewash history and say, oh, it's always been consistent. They admit it's incredibly messy. But they offer a completely different tool to read the map.
Yeah, think of it like a GPS system.
A GPS. Okay, walk me through that.
When you are driving using a GPS, two very distinct things are happening simultaneously. First, you have the traveler that's you. You are moving. The terrain around you is changing constantly. You might be in a city, then a desert, then a forest.
Right. I'm dodging traffic, I'm turning left, I'm navigating roadblocks.
But for that little blue dot on your screen to know exactly where it is and more importantly to know which way is true north, it needs to lock onto something that doesn't move at all.
The satellites.
Exactly. The satellites are high above the atmosphere. They are fixed. They provide the constant signal. And the thesis we're exploring in the sources today is that the confusion, that dizziness you felt in the intro doesn't come from the satellites moving. It comes from the traveler navigating shifting terrain.
So in this analogy, the satellites are divine law, and the terrain is what? Human culture, history,
Cultural context, economic reality, human development, all of it. And the argument is that we often mistake the noise of the journey for a change in the actual signal.
I really like the metaphor. It's clean, but I want to stress test it right now because the atheist critique, as outlined in the source material from J.R. Ahmed, is pretty damning. It's called the argument for moral relativity, and it doesn't just magically go away with a cool metaphor about satellites.
Fair enough. Let's hear the critique. Let's look at the evidence.
Well, it starts with what they call cross-cultural whiplash. Basically, what is highly moral in one zip code is a mortal sin in another. The source mentions the Aztecs. Now, to us, sitting here in a studio today, ripping a heart out of a living human is murder. Plain and simple. But to an Aztec priest, that wasn't murder at all. It was a divine necessity. They literally believed if they stopped, the sun wouldn't rise.
It's a gruesome example, but an accurate one regarding their internal logic. They genuinely thought they were saving the world.
Right. Contrast that with the modern sanctity of life. Or look at the exposure of infants. In ancient times, Sparta, Rome, if a child was born weak or deformed, or even just if times were tough economically, leaving them to the elements was seen as a practical, even responsible decision for the good of the family. Today, that's unthinkable. That's a massive felony.
And the skeptic looks at that massive gap and says, see? There is no satellite. There is no fixed star. It's just us biologically adapting to our environment.
Exactly. They would argue that evolution explains this way better than theology. Evolutionary ethics says we developed altruism because it helped the tribe survive. We developed social contracts like, I won't kill you if you don't kill me, because it's pragmatic. It's not a command from the heavens. It's just a survival strategy from the savannah.
And that inevitably leads to the conclusion that morality is entirely a social construct. Because if God were real and unchanging, his rules shouldn't need updates or patches like a piece of buggy software.
Right. Why would an eternal God allow slavery in 1000 BC but hate it in 2024? If the signal is constant, why is the reception so wildly different? Why does the output change so drastically?
This is where we have to introduce a concept that is absolutely central to the rationalist perspective in our sources. It's a term you might have heard, but we need to define it properly. It's called Fitrah.
Fitrah, okay. I have heard it translated as instinct or nature, but those feel a bit vague. Give me the technical breakdown.
So linguistically, it comes from a root, meaning the first digging or splitting. Think of it as the factory settings of the human mind.
Like the pre-installed operating system on a smartphone. Before I download a bunch of apps and clutter it up.
Precisely. Before you download any apps which are like your culture, your parents' teachings, your school, there is an OS already running. The argument here is that while customs, the software we load later, vary wildly, the hardware of the human intellect is designed from the start to receive specific frequencies. There is a universal receiver built into us.
So regardless of whether you are an Aztec priest or a modern accountant, you have this exact same hardware.
Yes. And this hardware is perfectly tuned to pick up specific satellites, those immutable principles we talked about. The source lists them clearly. Justice or adlor, the sanctity of life, truthfulness, compassion for the vulnerable.
But hold on, if everyone has this hardware, this Fitrah, why did the Aztecs sacrifice people? Why did the ancients bury infants? Was their receiver just broken?
That is exactly the point the rationalist perspective makes. The noise isn't the law changing, it's the receiver encountering massive interference. The source uses the example of pre-Islamic infanticide. The Quran describes people burying their daughters alive out of fear of poverty or shame.
Yeah, pretty horrific stuff.
But here's the key distinction. The source points out that the Quran frames this not as, oh, their morality was different back then, but as they were actively violating their own fitrah. It says they killed their children due to corruption caused by fear. The signal from the satellite was always, do not kill. The static of poverty and fear scrambled the message on the ground.
That's a really interesting pivot. So when a society does something that looks totally evil to us now, the argument isn't that they had a valid alternative morality, it's that they were experiencing a malfunction.
A deviation, yes.
Yeah.
The source argues that deep down, human beings have always known that killing an innocent is wrong. The evolution of morality isn't the invention of new rules. It's humanity slowly clearing the static and tuning the receiver back to the original frequency. It's about removing the viruses from the software so the hardware can run as intended.
Okay, I can see that for things like murder. Most people get that. But we have to address the elephant in the room. The source material spends a lot of time on this, and honestly, if we don't cover it, we aren't doing our job. It's usually the biggest sticking point in these debates.
You're talking about slavery.
Slavery, absolutely. If the constant signal is all about human dignity, why do the holy books, including the Quran, regulate slavery instead of just banning it instantly? If I'm God and I hate slavery, I say, no more slavery. Boom. Done.
This is where the GPS analogy gets really fascinating. The skeptic says, if God hated slavery, he should have said, stop it right now. But the source describes a very different strategy. It calls it a hostile takeover of the institution.
A hostile takeover, like corporate raiding. That sounds oddly modern.
In a way, it is. The source argues for a rational deconstruction. Imagine the terrain of the 7th century. The entire global economy was built on slavery. It wasn't just labor. Slaves were currency. They were the liquidity of the market. An instant ban might have been completely unenforceable. A prohibition that leads to black markets, economic collapse, and massive chaos because the structure wasn't ready.
It would be like banning oil and electricity tomorrow morning globally. The intention is good, but society would literally collapse before noon.
Exactly. So instead of a ban, what do you get? A compromise.
Well, that's what it looks like on the surface.
But the source says no, not a compromise. You get a trajectory. The source calls it the steep ascent.
The steep ascent, that sounds dramatic.
It is. The text asks, what will make you know what the steep ascent is? And the answer isn't prayer or fasting or pilgrimage. It is faku rakaba,
Which translates to what, exactly?
the freeing of a slave. It defines the absolute highest act of virtue specifically as breaking chains.
Okay, so it encourages it. But encouragement isn't abolition. People ignore encouragement all the time. I'm encouraged to floss, but I don't always do it.
True. But then it moves to what the source calls the budget line item. This actually blew my mind when I read it. We're talking about zakat here. The mandatory state welfare tax.
Right, the almsgiving, one of the core pillars.
The source points out that the Quran makes the abolition of slavery a mandatory line item in the state budget. It allocates public funds specifically to buy people's freedom.
Wait, let me get this straight. The government was mandated to use tax money to buy slaves and freedom.
Yes, it represents a deliberate economic strangulation of the institution. You have the state actively competing to remove inventory from the market. But it goes even further. There's something called the mukataba.
Mukataba. Sounds like a legal term. A contract.
It is. It's a contract of freedom. The source explains that if a slave asks for a contract to buy their own freedom, the master must grant it. It's not optional. And this is the real kicker. The master and the community are commanded to provide the capital to help them do it.
Whoa. So let's role play this. If I'm a slave, I can walk up to my owner and say, I want to buy my freedom, and legally, he cannot say no.
Exactly. He has to turn into your contractual partner. It shifts the dynamic entirely from property to debtor. And once that contract is signed, you are legally protected. You can earn money, you have rights. And he gets to give you some of his own wealth to help you pay him off.
That really does sound like a hostile takeover. You're turning the property into a legal entity with rights and using the owner's own capital to help fund the transition.
And finally, you close the door on supply. The source notes that the only way to acquire new captives was in very specific defensive wars. And even then, the command was grace or ransom. The goal was always to dry up the supply while draining the existing inventory through heavy spiritual and economic incentives.
So the argument is that the signal was always human dignity, or karma, but the navigation system had to guide the traveler from the incredibly rough terrain of human as property to the destination of intellectual sovereignty.
Intellectual sovereignty. I love that phrase from the text. The idea is that you cannot be a true trustee of God, a khalifa, if you are owned by another man. The Fitrah demands freedom. The law just provided the most effective roadmap to get there without crashing the car into a ditch.
It's a very compelling way to look at it. It's not that the morality changed, it's that the implementation had to be strategic based on the terrain. It's pragmatic idealism.
Exactly.
But let's pivot for a second. We've talked about the clear signal, but what about when the signal seems fuzzy?
You mean the problem of interpretation?
Exactly. The skeptic looks at this and says, if this is a divine message, why is it so hard to read? Why are there ambiguous verses, what the text calls mutashabihat, that cause fights and schisms? If I'm sending a life-saving message to humanity, I make it crystal clear. I don't use poetry that can be taken 5 different ways.
That's a valid frustration. If you view the text as just an IKEA instruction manual, ambiguity looks like a massive defect, like a smudge on the lens. But the rationalist perspective in our source flips this entirely. They argue that the ambiguity isn't a bug, it's a feature.
How on earth is confusion a feature? I hate confusion.
It distinguishes between 2 types of verses, Muhkamat and mutashabihat. Muhkamat are the foundation, the clear, precise principles. Be just, do not kill, help the poor. These are the satellites. They don't move. They are locked in.
Okay, so the core values are set. No wiggle room there. And mutashabihat.
Those are the allegorical or specific verses that require ijtihad.
Ijtihad. That means intellectual exertion, right? Like struggling to understand.
Yes, it implies serious effort. The source argues that if the entire book were a dry, legalistic instruction manual with 0 room for interpretation, the human intellect would simply atrophy. It would be a static rulebook for a robotic species.
So the ambiguity is there to force us to think, to make us actually work for it.
Think of it like a gym. If the weights are too light, if everything is easy and completely obvious, your muscles don't grow. The ambiguity provides the resistance. It forces us to engage, to adapt, to debate, and to grow. It keeps the text alive.
It forces the human mind to constantly check the terrain and realign with the satellites.
Right. It ensures that the faith is a dynamic relationship with the text, not just blind obedience to a checklist. The ijtihad, that struggle, is how we calibrate our internal compass. It prevents the religion from becoming brittle and snapping when the world inevitably changes.
Speaking of compasses, I want to go back to the naturalist argument for a second. We touched on it earlier. The idea that altruism is just a survival mechanism. The source has a really interesting rebuttal to this that deals with the Izot problem. I feel like we need to nail this down because it's the most common counterargument you hear today from the secular side.
Right. This is crucial. Naturalism is great at explaining mechanisms. It can explain how we survived. We survived because we cooperated. Groups that shared food lived. Groups that hoarded died.
Simple biology. Game theory. Tit for tat.
But the source argues that only explains the function, not the source. And it definitely doesn't explain the ought.
The ought.
Biology says we can cooperate to survive. It says if you want to live, work together. But the constant signal, the divine law, says we must be just, even when it actively threatens our survival.
Oh, that's a very big difference.
It is. Think about it. Why would a purely biological organism choose radical self-sacrifice? Why would you jump in front of a bus to save a total stranger who shares no genetic material with you? Evolutionary ethics really struggles with that. It calls it a glitch or a misfiring of the kinship instinct. Because biologically, that action is stupid. You die, your genes die. Game over.
But the Fitrah perspective says...
That says that's not a glitch at all. That's not a misfire. That is the receiver picking up the signal with perfect clarity. That capacity for radical goodness, for justice against your own self-interest, that comes from the source. The eyes of biology is, I want to live. The ought of the signal is, I must do right even if I die.
That's the difference between a survival instinct and a true moral compass. One keeps you alive, the other keeps you human.
Precisely. The source mentions a verse. Be persistently firm in justice, even if it be against yourselves. That is a command that goes against every single biological imperative of self-preservation. That is a signal cutting straight through the noise of the self.
So, bringing this all back to where we started, the desert, the dizziness, the sound of chains and ancient courtrooms.
We started with the idea that history is a chaotic mess of shifting values.
And the skeptic looks at that mess, at the wars, the changing laws, the hypocrisy, the noise, and says, there is no map. We're just making it up as we go.
But the perspective we've unpacked today says, no. The terrain is messy. The travelers are confused. The travelers are deeply flawed. But the satellites are fixed.
It's a total shift in perspective. Instead of looking at the changing laws of history as proof of God's absence, you look at the trajectory. The movement from slavery to freedom, from might makes right to universal rights. You look at that as proof of the signal constantly pulling us upward.
It's the steep ascent. We are climbing. And yeah, sometimes we slip. Sometimes we sit down and refuse to move. Sometimes we read the map completely wrong. But the peak hasn't moved. The mountain is still there.
You know, it makes me think about my own internal compass. When I see something unjust, when I see genuine suffering, I have this incredibly visceral reaction. I don't sit there and calculate the evolutionary benefit of helping. I just feel that it's wrong.
That's the subbase. That's the frequency we were talking about. The source would say that isn't just social conditioning. That's the first digging. That's the Fitrah. That is the part of you that remembers exactly where it came from.
It's a comforting thought, actually, that despite all the noise, the arguments, the social media wars, the constantly shifting cultural standards, there's something hardwired in us that knows north from south.
And the challenge, the real work of a lifetime, is to keep that receiver clean, to not let the static of ego or fear or cultural pressure drown out the sound.
So here's the question we want to leave you with today. We spend our lives arguing about the changing landscape. We fight about politics, about social norms, about who is right and who is wrong based on the current year.
But perhaps the real mystery isn't why the map changes.
No. Perhaps the real mystery is why, deep down, when the noise stops, we all know exactly which direction represents north. Is that instinct just a survival trick? Is it just your biology trying to get you to the next generation?
Or is it the signal?
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We will see you next time.